and welcome to Varn blog, and I'm here with Alex Prähauser, and we are talking Tolkien today.
Can I just stop you? You always say Prähauser, and it's very funny, but it's Prähauser.
Prähauser, okay. That's right, the umlaut makes it closer to a short E sound in English. Okay, Prähauser, and we are talking today about Tolkien and the relationship to the left. Alexander is an artist and a mathematician living in Austria, and you're pretty warm today. We were just talking about that off air. It's one of the fun parts of climate change. So I'll try to take that in consideration as we talk. How did you get into the works of J.R.R. Tolkien?
I actually don't remember exactly. I know it was The Hobbit was read to me as a small child. I think it was by my parents, but it might have been by my sisters. And I think my sisters gave me The Lord of the Rings pretty early on after I could read. So they told me that I would probably not understand it all, but they still gave it to me. And I read through it, and yeah, as they said, I didn't understand it completely, but it was very, very informative. And a short while afterwards, the movies came out, and I was I was negative on the movies even before that. I was kind of Tolkien would have hated this, and so on and so forth. But I saw them, and I had to admit that they were pretty good. But one thing that I noticed even back then was that I've always had a very abstract imagination, a very sketchy imagination, and the movies just completely supplanted my imagination of The Lord of the Rings. So afterwards, I just had the images of the movies in my head, and even back then, I noticed that film is kind of a more, I guess you'd call it reified medium, where it doesn't leave you as much space for the imagination. It also doesn't require as much conscious effort. And although I very much liked them back then, I always resented them for that reason, and that resentment grew over time. And nowadays it's actually pretty strong because I still can't get the images of the movies completely out of my head. I still can't really find my own imagination for Tolkien, and I think that's somewhat sad. But in any case, in my puberty, in my early youth, I started to read the Silmarillion, and I very much enjoyed it. I've always liked ancient myths. I liked to read the Jordin by Hesiod. I always enjoyed just understanding how people conceived of the world in kind of the mythic approaches. For that reason, I preferred it to Homer, although I never read the originals of Homer. And I also enjoyed Norse myth. I liked all kinds of myth. I think actually Age of Mythology and some other video games kind of helped along with that, because there was a lot of lore about Egyptian myth and Norse myth in these. And those are kind of the big mythic complexes that we still draw from. I think it's a bit of a shame that other mythic systems have been largely forgotten, but I'm always trying to find some pieces of other myths. And yeah, Tolkien drifted away from me for a while after that. I started to read other literature. I read the Dune books. I also enjoyed the Dune books, and all kinds of other things. But it always stayed in the back of my head. And also, I didn't really know what else of Tolkien was out there. I only knew the Book of Lost Tales, which had been translated into German, but I was in no way prepared for that, because those are really more scholarly works. And so for a long time, I didn't really read other Tolkien. And one thing that happened to me, which I think happened to a lot of my generation, is that TV shows kind of supplanted my love for books for a long while. And I, with the golden age of television, as they called it, The Wire and The Sopranos and all of that. But at some point, I came back to Tolkien, and I think a significant part of that was that there is some really good treatments of Tolkien on YouTube. There are some really good channels. And I'll maybe give some recommendations later, but I think we'll probably save that for the end. Through these, I gained a newfound appreciation of Tolkien. And over time, I noticed that I had become bored of modern literature for a while at this point. I noticed that, in fact, there were restrictions on modern literature that most people don't notice and just have completely naturalized, but that are really that actually really that limit the potential of literature itself, and that have been reigning in literature for at least the time of Cervantes, and so I grew very bored with all of this. Science fiction was a small exception, but I always came back to Tolkien, and over time I just noted that my appreciation of other things lessened, and my appreciation of Tolkien was renewed each time, and each time I could notice new things and new facets of the work. And I think it's a really deep work and a really important piece of literature. And when I say the work, what I mean is Tolkien's work considered in its entirety, or at least the work pertaining to Middle-earth and surrounding materials. So not just The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but also the Silmarillion, and also the entire history of Middle-earth and all the other supporting materials.
So it's interesting. Your story in regards to Tolkien is a little bit different than mine. Although the first book that I ever read, and I think I was about 6 years old, was actually The Hobbit. My mom had the 50th anniversary edition. It was a very nice edition. And I read it. My mom, being both a hippie and a Catholic, was very much into Tolkien. And I was somewhat luckier than you as far as like the movies not supplanting my imagination of what those books were, although I'm sure that it has changed it because I was 20 when the movie came out, and I'd grown up with two different sets of prior Lord of the Rings movies, both of which being not the Rankin and Bass ones aren't bad. The Bakshi one is kind of crazy, but since they had very different portrayals of the key characters, neither one of them really like solidified in my head. And so when Peter Jackson's movies came out, they supplemented things, but they didn't like replace my idea of what the books were. But I think if I had seen those movies just 5-10 years earlier, if I'd have just been a little younger, that would have froze it right there. And I agree with you on that there's something about the nature of cinema and television and about visual media, because it fills so much stuff out, that forecloses a lot of imaginative capacity. Now, I think, one of the interesting things though about those movies is like after the movies came out, like a whole lot of Tolkien's scholarly work gets republished. The Lost Tales, his translations of various Old English and Icelandic text. People started using his translation of Beowulf again, which had largely fallen out of favor when I was studying all that. And so I do have Peter Jackson to thank for a whole lot. And And the Silmarillion before the Peter Jackson movies was something we all talked about on Hushed Tones, because when I picked it up as a kid, and then I read most of my Tolkien between ages of like 6 and 16 originally. And I also interestingly read Dune about the same time. Those were my two big book series, and it's interesting to compare them, because in both cases you have sons publishing other work, but at least Christopher Tolkien never had the audacity to go and write a whole lot of Silmarillion tales on his own that are significantly worse than what was published. But I went back through it and I got fascinated with the Silmarillion, because when I approached it as a kid, I think I was about 15 when I tried to read a version of it. It read like both the Bible and translations of Beowulf. Like it was just totally alienating to me. And then when I approached it after the movies came out, I think I was probably about 25 years old. I found it fascinating, but by that time I had actually studied some Anglo-Saxon and some German literature, and I had gotten through the Bible. So it was a much easier haul, and I found the themes in it kind of interesting. Then, as I got more and more into left-wing stuff, and for people wondering, why are they doing a show on JR Talking on a Socialist channel? I started moving away from the Tolkien work, not just because I considered it juvenilia, although a little bit of me did. It was also because I was kind of convinced by a lot of people, and this is still a talking point, that since Tolkien was a kind of theologically conservative Catholic, that he was somehow a reactionary, right? And then liking Tolkien was kind of a way to to ignore reactionary fantasy stuff in your milieu. Over the last decade, I have really changed on that. One, I think the idea that we have to read authors based off their politics is kind of frankly silly. But two, I don't think you can reduce Tolkien's work to any of that at all. I think his even if he was politically conservative, and I don't know, even the more I've studied his life now too, I'm not even sure I can say that exactly. The man kind of seemed to be very close to an anarchist. That there's still a whole lot to glean from the Lord of the Rings, and even if Tolkien was kind of a reactionary, which again we've already said I don't necessarily believe that, why should we leave his work only to them, right? Why should we only let reactionaries have the classics, mythic works of fantasy literature that are quite rich? And one of the things about that, as I mentioned with my mom, is in the United States, at least, Tolkien's popularity didn't come from conservative Catholics, and it wasn't originally as children's literature either. Hippies really liked Tolkien, like a lot, and that had a big influence on a lot of stuff. Later on, it changes the sword and sorcery genre. Eventually, it even changes Dungeons and Dragons. But so for those of you who know my hobbies, there's a lot of intersections here. But I think that going back through particularly the Silmarillion and the Children of Hurin, which is kind of like drafts of other stuff that could have been in the Silmarillion, I have learned to really appreciate Tolkien as as a thinker who we can pull from, and like the idea, for example, that the dwarves are just anti-Semitic stereotypes, or that his views of like what a good society was basically a right ways. I don't think that that's totally fair anymore. Anyway, I wanted to get your response to that, because you're also a person who thinks that we can pull from this kind of literature on the left, even if the authors themselves are not leftists.
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree with you that we should, of course, consider the politics in works. And I also think we should consider the politics of the authors. And that actually, as a small side note, I think Tolkien is interesting in that he really challenges the concept of the death of the author, because you really can't put down a separating line between the private man and the works themselves, because if you only restrict yourself to things he published, you are missing out on a big part of the legendarium. If you include all of the history of Middle Earth, but don't include the letters, there's still important stuff in the letters. So you kind of have to consider the letters too. But then basically you have already the opinions of the man himself in the letters. But at the same time, he was very insistent that you shouldn't just read his works as some kind of immediate political commentary or something, that they can reflect on the world, but shouldn't be read as an allegory. You know, he had a famous distaste for allegory, that he said allegory was the conscious attempt by the author to make a story that represents something, represents some kind of point or something, whereas he preferred applicability, which is if people go to the works and read them and try to find out how they can apply them to the real world from their particular perspective. And he actually put that within the. He contrasted here the will of the author with the freedom of the reader, and so in this sense, this is kind of a liberatory concept. But also, you can't just narrow down Tolkien to freedom, although freedom plays a really big role in Tolkien. And I do actually, I think he is. I have a slightly different definition of reactionaries from yours, although related. To me, reactionaries just want to go back to a point in time before capitalism, and I think this can be go in a kind of temperamental direction. And a kind of political direction. Of course, the two are related. And I do put Tolkien into the camp of being temperamentally reactionary, according to that definition, but not politically so. And actually being politically not unaware, but very cynical about any possibilities for the world getting better or something. At least from what I can glean of his politics, although he was very reluctant to go into that. But I also want to mention that the Shire, and I think this is kind of a parallel that came to me when I also considered him in relation to Catrone. You know, my fascination with Catrone, and the distinction that Platypus draws between bourgeois society and capitalism. And the Shire, of course, Tolkien didn't want the Shire to be understood as some kind of ideal society. That wasn't what he was after, but it was a kind of society that what he temperamentally preferred, I think. Though with its downsides, but also it is very akin to early bourgeois society. You still have some nobility, but it is very sparse, and you have some kind of class collaborationism. Although we can really only say that from the relationship between Frodo and Sam. And you have very flat hierarchies. You have some kind of political organization, which is even a democracy, at least in parts, because the mayor gets elected, and it's possible for a kind of lowly worker to become mayor, if only he accompanies his master to basically hell and goes back. So it's actually very similar to early bourgeois society. And I don't think, of course, that Tolkien intended it consciously. I think he was just within the Shire kind of sketching something he loved, which was the disappearing English countryside. And I think within that countryside were the last traces of this early bourgeois society, and he kind of picked up on that subconsciously. And yeah, of course, there are many things one can say about kind of the in a wide sense political aspects of Tolkien's work, and we'll probably get into some of those. But yeah, that's my immediate reaction to the things you were saying.
Well, this is one of the things that I think about. It's interesting when we talk about fantasy literature because, like, for example, Tolkien's world, a lot of people misconstrue as like, particularly if they've just read The Lord of the Rings, right? It's kind of a mythical Middle Ages because there's kings and whatnot. That's a real big misreading. It's not like, it is mythical and it is based in myth, but it's not. It's not even primarily like Arthurian legends or something like that he's pulling from. He's pulling from a mixture of his immediate society, the society of the English countryside in the 19th and early 20th century, the shifts of industrialization, which he saw the end of and was pretty horrified by, the effects of World War I, but then also like pre even medieval, like basically what we would call antique myths. So Icelandic sagas, Anglo-Saxon sagas, Germanic writings, etc. And
also Greek stuff.
Yeah.
Though that's less emphasized, but of course Numenor is made after Atlantis, and kind of the whole allegory of the Silmarillion of the world to music is very akin to Plato's Music of the Years.
Well, that was actually, this is interesting. I was thinking about that because I'm like, one of the things you get into sort of like with some of the elf-human hybrid societies like Numenor is you have Greek stuff, you have the incorporation of like Platonic and Pythagorean themes. There's a whole lot of like, I mean, it makes sense given his profession, but there's a whole lot of like classicism that goes into some of the stuff. So I find it very interesting, particularly since there's been a tendency amongst certain kinds of groups to read him the way they might read his compatriot C.S. Lewis, who was purely an allegorical writer for the most part. I mean, like the Chronicles of Narnia are so veiledly allegorical that it's just, even as a child, I think I realized that like, oh, Aslan's Jesus, okay. Like, so it's interesting. Whereas when people try to do that to the Legendarium or the Silmarillion, they're going to have a hard time, actually. It just doesn't really work the same way. So I think it's interesting, and I think it's right to point out that, like, even when you're dealing with a fantasy construction of like antique myth that's retold, that like Tolkien's also not trying to hide that he is including things like the transition from what we would call early bourgeois to industrial bourgeois society. Like that's part of what he's writing about. He's not, I don't think he's so much, I mean, yes, there is like Catholic moral teachings in these books, but like he's not really trying to make an allegory for like biblical things that much. And it took me a while to understand that when I was reading him, because I had been like, oh, well, he's Catholic and, you know, he hung out with C.S. Lewis, so of course this is going to be an allegory. And like, it's not at all. I can't, like, I tried for years to make the allegorical readings work. You kind of can't. So why do you think there's been so much? Why do you think there's been a tendency on the left to to just classify. I mean, I've literally heard people call him a Nazi, which I think is crazy. But to kind of write him off as a reactionary, and fantasy literature and mythic literature as a whole as reactionary genres are concerned?
I think because it goes, particularly Tolkien goes against a lot of suppositions that Marxists have, and that to question is actually kind of dangerous for your Marxism. I mean, we have to admit that he was very pessimistic about the notion of human progress, and also that his entire legendarium is interwoven with a kind of refusal to capitulate to materialism. Mm-hmm. Of course, he was mainly thinking about materialism in the metaphysical sense, but also there is not really a lot of, or pretty much any historic materialism or things of that nature. And I think that that makes them suspicious, and also they would like to discount it because, well, again, it kind of goes against the whole progress narrative, and also it expresses a kind of sadness that has been there for from the beginning of modernity onwards, about the vanishing of fairy and the longing for fairy, and I don't think that they can really deal with that because it goes against the notion that humans can just be entirely rational creatures, and yeah, if you have to question that, you have to question a whole bunch of stuff, and you know, I like to contrast that with Star Trek, which I think is of like modernist art, maybe the one that has that elicits the most similar kind of passion from people, and which kind of portrays a somewhat utopian society, particularly in Next Gen, which might be what I consider the best expression of it. But the thing is that it's very cerebral, and it's very white, not in the racial sense, but in the sense of the color palette literally is very white. The measure of a man, as they like to call the episode, is rationality. It's not capacity for emotions, which of course animals also have emotions, but I do think that rationality without emotions is an empty, is nothing really. It's just a tool for the abuse by others, and ultimately it's not a future that I want to live in, which says a lot about me personally, of course, but I think also it shows that there's still a lot missing, and a lot of things that we have lost along the way, even in this idealized future. And I think a lot of those things are in Tolkien. And yeah, I think, again, this makes people, particularly modernists, suspicious of him.
This brings us some things that's come up on my show. For example, like I've become increasingly skeptical of Prometheanism, of linear Whiggish versions of history. Not that I don't think there's any progress, but progress has to be defined in very specific terms, and we have to know what we're talking about. I don't think like there's generic progress. Actually, this is a difference between me and Chris Catrone. Like we talked about regression, and I agree that like regression happens. But to understand regression, we also have to understand like what progress was towards, why it was ever considered an idea in the first place, and what it was aiming towards. And it can't be just like generically, well, things are getting better at like a la Steven Pinker or something like that, because I just don't think there's evidence for that. And one of the things that I find interesting if you get into Tolkien, despite, you know, we can talk about the classical thinking, because the classical thinking is declinist, everything's declining. Christian thinking is more interesting, it's more cyclic, but like things were good, then they were bad, but they will be good again. Lord, the Silmarillion's worldview, I do think there's some while I'm just warning about reading as allegorically Catholic, I do think like Tolkien's idea about like the fallen nature of humanity you can't ignore that when you're reading, particularly the Silmarillion. But even the First Age isn't great.
No.
Like
it's pretty terrible. But it's terrible in a mythic register, whereas when we come to the time of like the Lord of the Rings, the mythic is still with us, but it's receding. And with the end of the Lord of the Rings, it's really the dawn of the Age of Man is coming, or has already started, and the mythic is kind of expunged from the world. I mean, this is literally what happens with the fall of Numenor, that the realm of the primordial realm of fairy, the Valinor, gets removed from the world, and from then on, the elves are leaving, and it's more and more. It's getting more and more just human and rational, and kind of the register lowers.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. One of the things I remember, and my first memory of this is actually the Rankin Bass cartoon. So people who can hear my voice, you can tell that I'm a little bit embarrassed by this. But I remember thinking that like, oh, you know, for Tolkien and his mythic version of the world, like we are entering the beginnings of something like what we are. Hobbits are becoming more and more human. Dwarves and elves go away, and like he's just saying, like, you know, we like the mythic register is fading away, and we're becoming more and more what we would consider human. And there does seem to be like a tragedy for him in that. But there's also, I think it's interesting that he does not see that as like the Star Trek vision of the future, the antiseptic, everything kind of looks like a hospital plus an iPod. And he also, for example, he doesn't seem to be like extolling primitivism or anything like that, like, oh, we should go back to what primitive humanity was. Like he I don't even think he thinks that's possible, right?
No.
I mean, you know, what do you make of all that?
No, I agree with you. I don't think he thought that was possible. I think he was just sad about it, and he wrote down this sadness into literature. But I also don't think that he actually thought like that it was particularly fun to live in antique society. And of course, antique society for him was already pretty late. And we have to remember that he, even till the very end, was very insistent on the fact that this was fictional, but also in some sense true, because of course he kind of was a Platonist in his approach to world building, in that he literally believed in subcreation, so that the world that he, on the one hand, he believed that he discovered the worlds that he wrote about, and also he believed that maybe it's better to say hoped that maybe they were real in some sense, or at least would become real through the fire of the spirit or something. In some sense, not of course in the most immediate physical sense, but in some sense. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But yeah, he he was sad about it, and he wrote down his sadness.
I want to ask you a little bit about this, because I think people are going to be surprised at your take in particular, since, the last time you were on, you were talking about mathematics, and a lot of my engineering and math listeners, work. Some of them do a reading group with you. They listen, and I'm trying to figure out exactly how I should ask you this, but like, I find it interesting that a lot of people I know who are humanists, for example, really buy into the Star Trek vision of the universe. Not to pick on him, but like, that's like Doug Lane was going to eventually write a book about how Star Trek led him to socialism, etc. And I always found Star Trek to be incoherent. By that I mean like every time it tries to imagine a future, it also really can't. It's still really rooted in the day, and it's really optimistic, except everything about it is based on like, well, it's optimistic except that that's boring, and so we always have to violate everything that we supposedly believe in the society. Like, constantly the whole show is premised on it. And so for me, who I'm also a humanist, but I've had an interest in science my whole life, and I've also sort of like rejected that scientific notion of what the future could be. Like, I don't think that, if anything, my favorite Star Trek is Deep Space Nine, which is in some ways the biggest violation of the spirit of Star Trek. Like, so, and I like Star Trek as a kid. I watched, I grew up watching Next Generation. Like, it was on television when I was like, at the same time I was reading Tolkien. But what is there anything about working in the quote rational sciences like math that makes you actually doubt them a little bit?
Well, the thing is, I've always actually considered mathematics to be the last bastion of the romantic, because it's outside of this world, at least if you're a Platonist, and Platonism was always also the last bastion and kind of the unassailable bastion of those that didn't just want to resign to materialism. And that's one of the things that drove me to it. And of course, it is very done through the application of the mind. And so it's not really, it is creative, but it's not creative in the same way as like writing a book is or something. There is a profound difference, but still there are different kind of temperaments that are driven to mathematics. I do think there is they are mostly of a certain type, but it's very difficult to really describe what the commonality is. But there are very, very science-minded persons that are driven to mathematics. But there are also a great amount of romanticists.
Absolutely.
And I think,
Go ahead.
And I think, for instance, even you could say that about Grothendieck, and a lot of mathematicians start to doubt science, and Grothendieck also very much became anti-scientific in a way. And also he considered just science to be destructive, and at least within capitalism, and at the very towards the end to be a work of the devil in a way, at least certain sciences. So there is something within mathematics that is not that doesn't align with, for instance, engineering in the same way. But also I wanted to mention that this is actually something that made me disillusioned with science fiction, which is that at its core it's kind of based on a lie, which is that the universe out there really is a magical and wondrous place, which is what Next Gen, for instance, is all about. and the first gen Star Trek, we've kind of discovered everything on Earth, and we've cataloged everything, and it's all we know it all. But we can go out into the universe, and there are lots of species that we can interact with. There are like almost omnipotent beings like Q and the Q Collective or Continuum, and there are all of these fantastic creatures that we can meet and interact with. And actually, they are much more foreign to humans than anything we could imagine, which is kind of a problem for storytelling, because you can't really imagine creatures you can't imagine. But they are out there, and we can meet them and talk to them. And really, when we actually look at the universe, it's very cold, it's very empty. There isn't any sign of life. And if you actually do the equations, kind of the Drake equation is a vast oversimplification. It's absolutely possible that we are the first intelligent species with the capacity to develop technology and such to come into existence within the known universe, and maybe within several universes, if you assume that there are parallel universes. And that the probability for life, for intelligent life that's capable of producing technology to evolve is actually much lower than we've ever thought. And in any case, if the galaxy really was beaming with life in the way that, for instance, Star Trek wants to make us believe, or at least hopes in its core, then we would have already seen it. So really, there is vast emptiness out there, and this desire for a lot of science fiction is actually driven by the desire for fairy manifesting again, and trying to become aligned with what we know about science. But really, it's always based on a lie, because it never can take science for what it is. But also I think that I do think we can't just discount materialism, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be interested in Marxist thought. But I'm hoping that the situation gets better once we get through matter, in a way, once we really understand it. And I think if we actually consider, this, I've written it to you a few times about it. If we really consider not just the developments of quantum mechanics that started at the beginning of the last century, but the current developments in string theory and M theory and such, I think actually there is a bit more magic than we would have given it credit for.
I laugh because you know you're picking at our differences, that like I tend to be skeptical of Platonism, and I think M theory and brain theory is actually mathematically super important. So before people get mad at me about that, but I tend to actually see it as quasi-metaphysical, and I suspect that you might say, yeah, so what?
Yeah, exactly. Finally, we're getting beyond physics.
Right. And so, I think my response is, I don't really have a response to that. If we're agreeing that it might be metaphysical, and also, that we're talking about something that contains science, has science in it, for sure. I mean, I'm not saying that like M theory and brain theory are anti-scientific, but that they might be beyond how we currently understand science, like in any of the scientific methodologies. And I've also become, I think you might have picked this up from me, I don't know if people know this, I used to be a very strict demarcation line of science person. In fact, I wasn't even sure if I considered math part of science. Like, and I've kind of backed away from that, because the more I've thought about like the Vienna School and the various attempts to define science, the more I get to what there's a bunch of things that I can see that they share, but there's not one thing that I could say as a line in any case. Like falsifiability is not really a line in science, like, because probability, if you're being strictly logical, messes that up. You can't truly falsify anything. And so people who will hear this will go like, oh, but yes you can. I'm like, really? You can't? Like
you can't.
Logically you can't. Like,
you could throw up a coin an infinite number of times, and it could always land on head. And the probability for that is actually 0, but it still can happen in exactly one case. So even probability theory can't really catch that, interestingly.
Oh, that's I don't think even I've thought of that. Thank you. So I think there's something to this. I wanted to bring up, though. I got one time a friend of mine who, when I say he is a reactionary, I am actually not insulting him. He would say he is a reactionary. But he would always come up to me and would go, well, you're not really a leftist because you have a tragic view of humanity. Like, and one of the things that I think this is kind of not an appealing call to people, but for me to go, I don't want to cede the tragic view of humanity to people who are like pro-capitalist or whatever. For one thing, I don't think capitalism has a particularly tragic view of humans. But two, the idea that any of us who have like, well, the idea, that there's nothing we're ever going to have that's going to be completely de-alienated and totally rationally functional. Like, I don't think that will ever happen. There's too many contradictions, both in a strict sense and in a kind of Hegelian sense, that emerge in any social system for us to say that, like, it's purely rational. And while I do think that people like, say, David Graeber underestimate the effects of like social inputs and geographic inputs and whatnot, and physical material limitations in development of societies, because they seem to think that you can just think it into existence. I do think, however, we shouldn't discount thought as one of the even material inputs into how societies develop. And because I do think, for example, when we look at like egalitarian societies that are what we would call like pre-modern, and most of these are hunter-gatherers, immediate subsistence hunter-gatherer societies, but not all of them, they do have to come up with like social and mental strategies to enforce, to kind of mentally enforce equality. And sometimes it's even violent. But I think it's interesting because when you read someone like Tolkien and someone who's like really dealt with ancient literature, that becomes a lot clearer about like, okay, we have to actively inculcate humility in the people. They're not going to just have it. We have to, like, maintaining a relatively egalitarian society like the Shire actually takes a lot of work, and it's really easy to unbalance. And I think that kind of like reality check is important for socialists to have, even if it comes through literature, speculative imagination, and that sort of thing, because that's part of how we're modeling our narratives in our world. Whereas I think, like, you're right, the Star Trek vision of the universe is basically infinite progress forever, and the universe is a magical wonderland full of cool beings, and everything is also kind of like us, even though even though we're trying to, like, it's totally not human, but ultimately it very much is. And it's like, I find this to be I do find that to be, quite frankly, the more fantastical proposition. Like, so, but let's get into Tolkien's politics. One of the things that I find fascinating about Tolkien is, for example, he really does distrust political power. It's hard to find a character, not just in the Lord of the Rings, but even in the Mythic cycle, that has massive political power, that problems do not flow from that. So would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and that actually comes up in The New Shadow, which was the sequel to The Lord of the Rings that he kind of began. And he held that the greatest, and I don't exactly remember if he phrased it in that way, but that the greatest weakness of humans is the fact that they just become disatiated with what they have so quickly, and that they are always looking for new things. That what is common is never enough for them, and this theme of fall would have replayed within that work, which is one of the reasons for why he didn't continue it, because even he thought it was a bit too tragic. But yeah, in general, he also has a very dim view of the capacity for systems to remain free of corruption. Basically, every system that at least that's populated by humans in his work is always gets always corrupted, and from time to time they can be repaired, but usually that's only temporary. It's really it's very similar actually to the iron law of oligarchy. I don't know if he knew about that. I doubt it, but I think it's actually something that is common to a lot of conservative thinking. And it's, I think, a valid objection. Yeah, on the other hand, he had was very skeptical of attempts to kind of forestall decline. I mean, that was not really a sin, but it was one of the things that the elves did that wasn't maybe all that great, that they were trying to prolong their time in Middle Earth. And with that, of course, prolong the wonder of fairy and the realms that they had, which were quite wondrous. Of course, that resulted in the Rings of Power being made, and in Sauron coming to power anew. Or at least grasping for power anew, and destroying lots of things in the process. And ultimately, they could only achieve greater salvation by letting go of their own realms, and by fading. So this theme is also very strong in his works. And I think that actually echoes some of the things you were talking about with Oswald Spengler. Also, I don't think that Tolkien knew about Spengler, but again, it's just a kind of pattern that conservatives often think in terms of civilizations rising and then getting their day in the limelight, basically, and then fading away. And Tolkien's view was that this is just something that happens. It's kind of tragic in a way, but it's also not something that you should try to counter, or otherwise you'll end up doing things that might be even worse than the things that that you were trying to prevent. And
you go ahead.
That's also I mean, the case study of Numenor is really interesting in a lot of ways. But of course, when the Numenorians eclipsed and started to become too dissatisfied with their lot in life, and in particular with the fact that they still had to die, they started to see themselves as kind of superhuman, which they had capabilities that other humans didn't have. But they saw that as a license to subjugate other humans and start an empire in a way that perhaps might be at least subconsciously influenced by the British Empire. But that's only speculation on my part. I want to make that clear. Of course, it only hastens the downfall, and it makes the decision of the Valar to ever give them amelioration of from suffering or from death, at least for a while, a mistake, and it renders this choice tragic.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting take. I think there's people will accuse Marxism of being lapsarian a lot of the times, which is like, oh, you're trying to return back to this primitive communist society, which I don't think is true. But what I will say seems to be a fair criticism of Marx and Engels is that maybe they did ultimately have a Whiggish view of history. I don't know. I know that my analytical Marxist friends, for example, they definitely do. And they also believe in transhistorical, constant drive for for improvement and accumulation as essentially human. Whereas I think my entire life I've had a more cyclic view of civilizational history that is optimistic in the one sense that I do think we do learn from each prior cycle of an empire or civilization, and thus things are actually improving both scientifically and in some ways socially, but that they're not that it's not going to innately stay that way, and that a lot of attempts to try to keep it that way end up doing a lot of damage. And one of my critiques of the entirety of, I'm not going to say Western, I'm not going to be so arrogant as to speak for Europe here, but Anglo-North American society, so the United States and Canada, is that in some way, both sides of our political spectrum have a kind of impossible sense of maintenance. That one has a kind of progressive liberal view, the other has a make America great again view, but both of them have a view of nearly infinite, at least stability, and a resentment at decline that doesn't try to even deal with it in a realistic way or mitigate it in ways that kind of accept that parts of it are going to happen no matter what. I think that's kind of made my society a little bit crazy. And it shows up in the kind of wild emotional privileging and swinging that comes around, and attempts to just impose pure analytic rationalism on it, a la what someone like the people from Less Wrong do. What they really end up doing is hiding their emotionality and subsuming it, and not being totally honest about what and why they want, not being totally honest about some of their arguments that are based on reason are not really reason at all. They're based on a whole lot of presuppositions. And one of the things I think the left should do, in so much that we're worried about the development of society and workers' power and all that, is actually kind of, I think Matt McManus actually was right about this, to not have such a gleaming view of human nature or a totally Promethean idea that there isn't one, or that you can forever starve off entropy, even though I realize, like, technically speaking, we're not in an anthropic system because of the sun.
But the sun will die soon. Well, not soon, but pretty soon.
Yeah, eventually. Yeah, and in a cosmic scheme of things, actually sooner than you think, right? We don't live at a cosmic level, but you're absolutely right. So with all that in hand, it's just I think I would like I guess one of the reasons why just talking about Tolkien appealed to me is I would like a left-wing form of thinking that was more willing to deal with that in its psychological conceptions, more willing to, like, not try to promise the end of history, not try to promise that we're going to get beyond all these contradictions or whatever, but we're going to deal with what's coming up. And we know that, for example, like, I'm a big I guess this shows up in my talks about complexity theory, because I'm like, at a certain point when people are like, well, what can we do about complexity? And I'm like, simplify. That's really your only option, or it's going to be done for you. Things will just fall apart. Like, what you can't do is, like, try to maintain everything at their current levels and be able to run the system. I don't think that's possible. And I know that, like, I know that of all the episodes I've done in the last couple of months, I think this one's the one that's going to get to people, because I'm like, I think some of what people want, and they ask me questions for, I'm just like, you can't do that. Like, it's not that's not even, I'm not saying you shouldn't dream, but, like, this idea that we're going to have infinite energy forever, infinite human growth, and our society's just going to get progressively better and better. There's no historical evidence for, like, we don't have a society on Earth that's ever done that. Like,
it's not physically possible. And I mean, it's really just sublimated depth drive. And if you go to those legs for it, and you still have to ignore physics, then just go back to the start and just believe in an afterlife. I mean, it's actually more realistic in my conception of things.
That's an interesting idea. Why do you think it's more realistic?
Well, because we know that entropy will increase, the universe will get bigger and bigger. I mean, there is the possibility that it goes back to a point, but even then, we'll all still die. So we know that, but we don't really know anything outside of the universe. At least, I would argue we know a few things about mathematics, but we don't know if there's other things beside mathematics outside of the universe. All we have is what we see and what we can reason about, and that is necessarily an incomplete picture. And I do think that it is, that I do think that it is actually necessary for there to be an outside of the universe, because I think everything, every internal structure also has an external. A kind of external expression, and this holds for the physical universe itself and holds for every structure. So I do think we have reason to believe that there's an outside. We don't really have any concrete reason to assume that there is a concrete afterlife after that, but we don't know that it's not the case, which is more than in the other direction.
But that's a fair point. I would say that I would even maybe agree with the possibility is low, but it's higher than, say, infinite energy forever. So I could see that. I mean, I guess I'm expressing a sympathy for, like, why mythic views of the world exist. Like, I actually think, like, there's a reason why it exists, and it's not just human irrationality or whatever. Like, it is a way of both coping and inculcating certain ideas, often about human limitations that we don't want to necessarily always deal with. And I don't want to, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I don't want to sound like a total crank. I'm not even a psychoanalyst. But I sometimes do think this refusal to accept these things is leading people to be extremely unhappy, and to be, frankly, unable to be the kind of subject that a left would need. I mean, a lot of leftists come to me with like, what can I do? And my first response is like, okay, get involved in an organization, get social, but also, like, frankly, improve yourself, because you're not in any shape right now. Like, and you know, that could be, for most people it's mental, for some cases it's mental and physical. And I'm like, this really does, like, if you want to do this, you really have to improve yourself, not because of like this abstract sense of, like, you know, self-help or whatever, but because, like, if you're part of a group, you have an obligation in a way to be functional in your best self, and not, you know, and if anything, try to use that, other than like self-care or whatever, to motivate you to take care of yourself. People, you know, people actually tend to do better on things like maintaining their health or maintaining mental balance if they're doing it for more than just their own gratification. And I know that's like kind of against this current point of, quote, bourgeois society, but I think like that's part of the damage of alienation, is like you stop believing that there's any reason to keep yourself up, that total self-ownership isn't like enough motivation to do anything. And it's one of the things that I really found fascinating about the Lord of the Rings is privation and Lord of the Rings. Now, this is a very Catholic idea, people, but I think it is still useful for leftists to have, that privation and alienation in Lord of the Rings is usually the way that evil's gonna get you. Like, if you look at Gollum, for example, like, you know, Gollum is a self-destructive addict. And how did he get that way? Well, you know, he severed his relationship with his own community, and there's nothing beyond that once that's done, other than his own guilt and shame, that can maintain that, and it leads to his sense of self fragmenting. And, you know, ironically, the more selfish he is, the more fragmented his sense of self gets. And, you know, people might push back on me, oh, that's a pre-scientific understanding of human psychology, but I'm like, I don't know, it mirrors a lot of what I see even in the psychiatric literature. Like, if you like, you want to break somebody, isolate them, like, and it'll shatter their sense of self eventually. Like, and I think, you know, I think Tolkien deals with that realistically, where something like Star Trek just doesn't deal with it at all. And so, you know, maybe this is me justifying my own taste as a child. And there was a point in my life where I got very tired of Tolkien-esque literature and got really into Gene Wolfe, another arguably reactionary Catholic. But, you know, one of the things I realized about reading Gene Wolfe, or about reading Frank Herbert, and I will say this, all these people could be considered conservatives, but Herbert's also interesting too, because, for example, a lot of people overread the white savior narrative stuff in Herbert, because Herbert thinks the savior is a questionable concept, like that a singular savior is almost always going to be bad. But there's a sense in Frank Herbert that, like, you know, yes, empires emerge, and yes, they're kind of normalized, but also like anti-imperial imperial struggle is noble. And we know from his personal, you know, politics, that while he had a very weirdly conservative view of like American development, he also was utterly sympathetic to local indigenous peoples in ways that was actually super uncommon. Like there was a book he wrote where like a key figure sacrifices himself, you know, a white figure sacrifices himself so that an indigenous community can make a point and liberate itself, and it's seen as it's portrayed as a morally justified good. And so one of these things, what a lot of these more quote conservative unquote writers, and I think reading them in terms of modern political conservatism is not helpful, but is that they actually do have an understanding of like why humans feel the need to be liberated when it might be just. They're not blind to that. And I think a lot of, I'm also going to get in trouble for saying this, but a lot of like mid 20th century progressive science fiction or whatever, I've always found just to be bad literature. Like it to me, a lot of the people in that kind of literature, and here I'm not just thinking of Star Trek, but I'm thinking of like Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, a series that I like, but like I'm like none of the characters in that world are believable to me. They seem way too simple. And so and I know there's like progressive leftists who are mad at, for example, like, you know, the new literary turn in science fiction in the 70s, because it became a lot more like literary fiction and fantasy about its view of like human progress and whatnot and the problems with that. But it's always struck me that was a much more realistic view anyway. So, you know, I mean, I guess this is kind of the final question, and then we can talk about sources if people wanted to get into Tolkien beyond the text. But what about, you know, we've talked about Tolkien's sense of like sadness and his view of like even human relationships are flawed because of, you know, the contradictions in the fallen nature of man. And I'm not telling leftists that they need to take on like a Catholic view of original sin or something. That's not what I'm arguing here. But I do think we should actually look at the way contradictions emerge from human systems as probably more tragic and unforeseen and in some ways not entirely avoidable than we are. And then we currently do. And if we did, we'd be able to better understand and deal with things like, you know, reactionary shifts in politics or limits to growth, not over promising on technology and stuff that we pretty much have no idea how we do and can't probably do anyway. Just something that like has a more realistic view of planning, a more realistic view of human cooperation. And I'm not saying that we should like become primitivist or even necessarily what people think degrowthism means, but that we should incorporate this into our worldview. In what other ways maybe we haven't touched, you think Tolkien helps with that?
So this actually goes to something that I really wanted to touch on, and I'm hoping that I can do it justice. And I can't really straightforwardly answer your question, but maybe I can leave you with something to think about, which is that, well, this really all goes to the question of the meaning of life. And of course, there are these common phrases of, well, the meaning of life is what you make of it, or there is no inherent meaning of life in life, and just enjoy it. And these answers are profoundly dissatisfying because they work if you're happy or if you're at least decently comforted. But if you're really suffering, they don't work at all. And one of the things that we've had to learn from liberalism is that we really can't aggregate and disaggregate experiences, meaning that we can't just deal with aggregate happiness and aggregate suffering or something like that, which I have seen people do a lot of the time when they consider these questions. But really, we have to consider individual experiences. And then we have to think about, for instance, the baby that is left out by the Spartans in the woods to die by being eaten by a wolf or maybe by starving. And these beings will know nothing but just hopeless misery, not just in the sense that they are hopeless, but that there is no hope for them. Well, if we're progressive, we can say that, well, maybe we can get to a point where we can eliminate these kinds of cases, where at least we might not get rid of all suffering, but at least we can get to a point before each human life is worth living in the end. But one of the things that even liberalism doesn't allow itself to consider is that we can't even aggregate nature in this way. So we can't talk about the environment or nature or something and be honest to the liberal idea, because we have to consider animals, each one of them, in isolation as not an individual, but a being itself. You know, Tolkien loved plants. He always talked about his fondness for plants. And normally I discount the arguments about like consideration for animals in terms of, well, don't you consider plants? Because I think they are just a cop-out to not really have to consider them. But maybe there is a point to that, and we have to consider the experiences of plants even. I don't know. And I've always held that my ethics has always come from the idea that we have to we have to kind of use the golden rule, but modified in the sense that we consider empathy to the extent that we can understand that the being that we empathize with actually has these experiences. So we can't just give animals like the right to vote because they don't have rationality, but they have the capacity to feel pain. And if you truly consider that, then life becomes very hard to justify. And in particular, you have to think, can the suffering of a few beings be justified in terms of a lot of other beings, or maybe not all that much other beings, depending on where you see historical development. The contentness of some other beings. And usually when you phrase this question in this way, then most people would say that of course not. Of course you couldn't do that. You can't just justify the suffering of a few by the pleasure of the many or whatever. But if you deny this, then it leads you to some very hard considerations, and you might even consider whether life is something that should be maintained. And I think that was always my approach to Buddhism, that it touched on this, and that its answer was kind of no, that life is a kind of prison that we have to escape from. And even if we arrive personally at a point where we are content, then there is still too much suffering. And in particular, Buddhism kind of keeps its boundaries through karma, because karma acts both as a kind of guard against its most radical tendencies, in the sense that you can't just kill yourself, or you can, but you'll just wake up in another cycle and probably you'll be a squirrel or something, and it will be even worse. And on the other hand, if you reincarnate often enough, you probably get enlightened at some point. So it's not all that bad. But if you truly secularize this, then there is really then being dead actually implies being enlightened. It implies being out of the cycle of Dharma. And if you think about this truly and deeply, then you might arrive at the consideration that, and if you consider the capacities of industrial society that the Buddha just couldn't consider, then it's entirely possible to arrive at the conclusion that it's actually a moral obligation to end life, to do an omnicide, to just destroy everything. And we might actually have already the capacity for this with nuclear weapons. But of course, you can think about this even further, and you think that if we are the first sentient species that we know of, then we have the moral obligation to stop life from evolving wherever we can. So actually, we shouldn't just nuke the planet, but we should build, my thought experiment, a giant Dyson beam that is capable of sterilizing all worlds in its vicinity, and then kill ourselves with it. And I think actually from a Buddhist perspective, there is not much that is wrong with that, because it's not really a liberal philosophy. It doesn't consider the desire to live something that is a reason for keeping a thing alive. It's just in terms of suffering, and the suffering murder inflicts, and the fact that you don't, even the murdered being isn't really excluded from the cycle of Dharma again. But if you can commit omnicide at one moment, then there is not really any suffering that results from this. So there isn't really a problem in that sense. And I think this is actually an entirely rational conclusion, and one of the few ones that can be considered that is honest in that regard. And of course, this is this is kind of where Thomas Ligotti's thought leads to, which is why he's one of the few authors that I also appreciate from the last century. Although even he didn't consider it to that extent. But in any case, this is one answer. Another is to just kill off the compassionate impulse within you, or at least try to. I don't think it's that easy, and it might lead to all sorts of psychological pathologies. But that is what I see as the Nietzschean way. And I think that is also an answer that is workable, or that at least is coherent, let's say that. And then I guess you can add maybe Nick Land, where he says, well, sure, this is true about nature, but soon we'll all be machines, and machines will kill everything else. And machines can reprogram themselves to not feel suffering. And so this way we can escape, which I think is also fairly coherent. And all of these solutions, it's fair to say, are not to my liking. It's not to my it's not what I consider to be even just healthy, to be a healthy philosophy to live with. Not for the individual nor for society. And I think Tolkien actually has, through his concept of Estel, of hope, as I describe it, of hope that the physical dissonance of this universe is to be completed by a metaphysical consonance. Again, through a kind of metaphor, through music, wherein it makes actually sense. And that once we all get to appreciate creation in its entirety, and not just from our particular perspective, which of course is an illiberal thought, but nevertheless, that we'll all see that it has been good, and that it was better for the universe to have existed than to have not existed. And this is for me also a conception that is workable, although of course, not something that can be just taken over straightforwardly, because Tolkien had kind of the advantage of still remaining within Christian thought, which is a luxury that a lot of us just cannot have. And the left has also a kind of answer for it, I think, which is just the progressive answer of, well, we'll solve that problem, and then we'll solve that problem, and eventually we'll get to a point where humans don't just suffer hopelessly, but it doesn't even get to the stage where it can seriously consider the same for animals. And I don't know, and thinking about that would be a much more radical thought, which I think Adorno, the late Adorno, touched on in his aesthetic theory somewhat. But I don't know if there can even be a leftist answer, and this is maybe my doubt, my kind of skepticism towards progressivism in general. I don't know if there can even be a leftist answer, but I think it would suit the left well to at least consider the problem honestly.
Yeah, I have always told people that, like, David Benatar, who basically made the argument that you think is like the rational deduction from Buddhism, I think he makes it from utilitarianism, which is a liberal philosophy, but because he weights suffering as more than pleasure in his way, he's like, no, we should end all life, basically. I do find that dissatisfactory. I think if you ran a society off of that, it would be a disaster. But I have to say that I haven't actually found it. Like, I haven't found a way to argue against that, other than to say, well, this is why this kind of rationalistic view of the person doesn't really work, right? Because it does lead you to, like you mentioned, the death drive. I mean, I can't think of a better expression of the death drive than that, is like the drive to end all life. However, I've also been increasingly moved, and I know I'm going to get accused of being a hippie for this, but being increasingly moved for, like, we have to think about the reality of more than humans. I find every day I want to eat less meat. And while I know that to some degree, even that's not entirely rational, there's a whole lot of, there's all kinds of animals that would still be naturally murderous because of their evolutionary pathway, etc. That I do think, like, oh yeah, viewing nature as an organic super being whole is not helpful, but, like, I should actually consider more like, what are we doing with all this? Can we actually consider more than just human life, and in our ability? Can we encourage kinds of agriculture that are not as dependent on animals, and maybe even better for like the general landscape? Can we really do that? This is why, like, degrowth socialism, I don't love the framing. I don't love it makes it sound like we're going to give up technology and stuff, and I don't think humans even can do that. Like, I think we would develop. My answer to primitivists was like, well, we'll just do this all again if you do that. Like, unless you figure out a way to lobotomize us, and then you might as well argue that we should destroy all life. Back to where, like, so yeah, I've actually done some of the same thought experiments, and my answer has tended to be like, no, we just, there's got to be a way in which, if we see values and virtues, we have a way of, like, considering this and considering these other things, and thinking even about, like, okay, why is there a human tendency towards animism, right? The belief that, like, all these things have human-like characteristics and whatnot. And we see that in multiple societies. It's not that these societies were all vegetarian, but they did have, like, in some real sense, an idea of, like, well, we have to limit this, because these other things are beings and whatnot, and we have to appease them. And it led to some weird things, including, and maybe not even dropping things like human sacrifice and stuff that I wouldn't necessarily want. But I do have to ask myself, because I tend to think most things that are human have existed for a reason, and most of those reasons actually are not, in their first instance, stupid. So, like, why were we like that? Why does that seem to develop in so many different kinds of people who've existed in so many different kinds of areas? And maybe it's because we actually do kind of innately get that, and as we progress technologically or whatever, we get alienated from that and just make excuses for why we don't consider the well-being of other beings and humans. I mean, we barely consider all kinds of humans. And there is a countervailing tendency in people, and I view this in, like, in anthropological terms, in the terms of, like, symbolic kinship, where we're always expanding who we count in the circle, but also always contracting it simultaneously. And I think one of the things that I think leftists should do, and I don't think this is a liberal conception of society, but is, like, we should be thinking about ways to expand this as big as we can, knowing that it'll never contain everything and everybody, because the very ideas that we're using to expand it are going to divide people. Like, that's just, and then when you start including the non-human, maybe even the concept of non-human persons, right? Like, this will get radically more complicated, because you're right, not everything can reason like us, not everything does. But you know, I've been on a while. Like, we should at least consider cetaceans and primates persons. We have every bit of evidence that they have as complicated reasoning and social structures as we do. And they aren't trying to kill us all. So, like, we can get away with it. But I think you're right that the Nick Land conception is coherent, but I also think it's wrong about what life is. You know, but I do think you're right that, and this goes beyond like workers' autonomy and stuff like that, which is stuff I believe in. For people, I'm not abandoning that here. But I do think sometimes we should ask ourselves these kind of like hard thought experiments that something like fiction can get you to actually like try to embody and play out, because it will get you to change maybe what I think in terms of virtue a lot, like what virtues you prioritize and which ones you don't, and what should progressive less be including in their calculations and what should they not. And I know you push back on people who have like a Promethean view of the world, who just do not consider animal well-being at all. Like, it's just not something they care about. And yeah, I just, like, I might prioritize the human over the animal, but I increasingly don't think we can just simply do that. Like, so yeah, I'm definitely with you on that. I think this is a very thought-provoking conversation. So, Alex, is there anything you'd like to plug as we finish up today?
Not really. I have a couple of articles that I plan to publish, but they aren't published yet. But at some point you'll find them probably on the internet. And other than that, I did with the subset of theoretical practice collective, I did one kind of presentation where I outlined my mathematical theory, which I think is very worthwhile to watch if you're into mathematics, and if you have a certain knowledge of it. But other than that, not really. There were a lot of aspects we haven't touched on. It's a shame. But yeah, I agree. It has been a good conversation overall.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I plan on having you back in a couple of months again to talk on more of these things, maybe when it's a little cooler in Austria. I kind of want to get into your ambivalence about Adorno to kind of pique what we might be talking about next, because I think you're fascinated with Catrone, but part of it's because you're kind of fascinated with Adorno, but you seem to be also kind of at war with Adorno too.
Yes, I have kind of hate. I don't know if I go towards love, but hate, at least fascination with him.
And I think,
and it's also very interesting to compare Tolkien's aesthetics and Tolkien's work with Adorno's aesthetics. Very interesting, I think.
So yeah, I would love to get you back to talk about Adorno, because Adorno is somebody, I come out of the Platypus Affiliated Society a decade ago, but even before I had anything to do with them, that's how they got me. Actually, I was obsessed with Adorno, and as I've aged and studied more, I find him a more problematic figure than I used to, and not just because he maybe worked for the CIA. The evidence for him actually having worked for the CIA is pretty thin. That I find there's something highly problematic about him, for lack of a better word. Yet also, like, he was thinking about things in a way that so few people at the time were willing to do. And so I do think he's what I like I don't consider him maybe as much as Nietzsche. You know, I think of Nietzsche as like my most serious enemy. Like he's the enemy that's sparring with and maybe incorporating and learning from, but also realizing he's an enemy is like the thing that a leftist should do. Because like to me, he's like, well, he's kind of the most evil, like he's the evil genius version of stuff that we have to deal with. But I also think Adorno, I would consider Adorno a frenemy. Someone who I don't want to entirely throw out and who I don't think is anti-leftist at all, but who's thought maybe we should really parse and maybe not just either totally reject or just blindly accept what seems to be the two primary options. Is we don't deal with him at all, what a Marxist, or he's the best thing that ever happened and we're just going to accept everything he says, a lot of other Marxists. And I think not to be all Aristotelian, but I think the truth lies somewhere in between those two poles. Thank you so much, and I'm going to have you back on. I always am fascinated with our conversations, and I maybe would like to talk about some of your other articles sometimes too. So I'll be in touch so we can plan out 1 or 2 more visits.
Great, but I actually thought about some Tolkien resources that
we need to share this. So let's end off on sharing Tolkien resources. So that's where we go. So go.
Yeah. On YouTube, there are some really good channels. There is The Red Book, which is great. There is Girl Next Gondor, which is sometimes a bit flippant, but she has a real appreciation and understanding of Tolkien. Her last video was really good about Eowyn and the Witch King and how many story threads just collide at this moment and get resolved. And there is Tolkien Lore, who doesn't do as much graphical splendor, but who also has some really good, deep understanding of Tolkien. And also a lot of he manages to disentangle at least the storytelling aspects of the movies from the books to some extent. Girl Next Gondor used to do that too, but sadly her videos got taken down. If you're really into Tolkien and you want to do some deep study of his works, there is Signum University, which came out of the Tolkien Professor podcast. And they really managed to do a little university out of that, which I find hugely impressive. And I think is also something we can organizationally learn from. And yeah, they have done episodes of all kinds of Tolkien's works. And currently they are doing a deep dive into the Lord of the Rings. They are currently at podcast episode like 270 with 1 to 1.5 hours each, and they're still not in Moria, which might be the most thorough exploration of any work of literature done by a community. Once it's finished, probably not currently, but it will really take the guy a lifetime. And I'm really thankful for him to dedicate his life in that way. Other than that, there's a huge body of literature. You can find lots by just Googling. There are particularly interesting, might be to your listenership, Tolkien Among the Moderns, which has a very strong Christian bent, but also Tolkien and Modernity, which has 2 volumes. And which both treat Tolkien as a reaction to modernity and the connections he has with other modernist figures and such. And there is, of course, Thomas Shippey's work, and in particular, Author of the Century. And Verilyn Flieger has done a lot of academic work on Tolkien. But that's once you're really into this stuff. Yeah, I think that those are the resources. Apart from the books themselves, of course, that I want to plug.
Yeah, I would tell people if you get through the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings, the history of Middle Earth and that part of the Legendarium is pretty good, and that box set's not super expensive. Yeah, I'm really in the Gene Wolfe scholarship, but I don't know if people. I have a lot of books back here, and a lot of them are nerdy. A lot of them like. I decided when I set up my room not to put my Marxology shelf behind me because I thought that was lame. But over there, like four or five books on Tolkien over there with my GMO scholarship. So it's fascinating. And if you're going to listen to stuff on YouTube and podcast, I think sometimes it's better to listen to this stuff or stuff about ancient myth and religion than it is to get into the political stuff. And it's not because I'm an escapist either. It's because sometimes I think like this stuff does less damage to your brain. Whereas some of that political stuff, it can take you in bad places. And it's not because I think people shouldn't be political. That's not my argument at all. I mean, obviously I do a political podcast, but
yeah, but a lot of the YouTube stuff is dumped down considerably.
Oh yeah. In yes, I can tell you, for example, I do the YouTube because I find a lot of people from it, and because it's a technology that's on a lot of people's TVs if you're poor, and if you like, so it's kind of everymanish, but I kind of resent it because a lot of the content on YouTube, particularly on politics, is really bad. And so like whereas podcasts are, there's also plenty of bad political podcasts, don't get me wrong, but there's more good stuff out there. And my show does better on the podcast world than it does on the YouTube world. And that makes sense. Like, I'm not making interesting animated videos. Although I've thought about it. I have thought about it.
But it's a lot of work.
Oh
God, it will limit the amount of material you'll be able to get out, because again, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a ton more. This is not hard. Although even doing this is 15 hours of my week. So like,
well, you're doing an insane amount of content. It's really impressive, actually.
But yeah. Thank you so much, Alexander. People should expect you to be back on probably a few times a year, because I personally get a lot out of our conversations, and you'll get, I think you get more response from me, because when you write me, you tend to get like 5. I tend to write you back with like I'm really interested in what you have to say, and that's it. And people who have worked with me know that that's how I tend to write. So I'm glad to always have you on and actually talk about what you're thinking about. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.